Hi and welcome back to my channel. In this video I will show you how I turned a large block of styrofoam into this diorama for the FW-190 and the railway flatbed car that I have shown you in the last videos. Let's start out with this big piece of styrofoam and those cutting templates made from MDF fiberboard. In the past I used my jigsaw to cut those MDF boards into shape, but for this project I had the opportunity to use a laser cutter. Using the laser saved me a lot of time and led to a cleaner result than using a jigsaw. When I designed the files for the laser cutter for those templates, I already included a few holes in the template itself. That gave me the opportunity to create sort of a sandwich of this fiberboard and the styrofoam in the middle. This way I was able to screw both templates together and then cut the styrofoam using my Proxxon hot wire cutter. Using the sandwich approach gives me a way cleaner cut than using just one template placed on top of the styrofoam. In the past I noticed that it's quite hard to cut a nice 90-degree angle with a hot wire cutter when your foam is quite thick, like in this case. When I cut out the styrofoam, I kept the wire of my hot wire cutter quite loose. This way the wire was able to touch the edges of the templates and I got a nice and clean result. The only downside of this approach is that you have to be quite careful when bolting together both templates, so they are in line with each other and not skewed. Also, before you start to wonder, the base you can see here is quite a lot smaller than the base I've shown you in the beginning. Unfortunately, a few steps later I noticed that the base I just cut out was way too small for the diorama I had in mind, so I went back to my computer, designed a new template, and also cut out a new base from styrofoam. I also had to redo the templates and the styrofoam for the railway platform. This could have cost me a lot of time and nerves if I had to redo the templates using a jigsaw, but fortunately I was still able to use the laser cutter, so this problem wasn't really one. Here you can see also another template. I had a small shed in mind that would sit on the edge of the diorama, and I created a template for that as well, so I was able to cut the shed in half, if you want to say it like that, so it conforms nicely to the curve of the diorama base. And now we are almost at the point where I noticed that this base would be way too small. I placed the railway tracks on top of the base, the platform is where it should sit later, and I also placed the template for the shed. After that I did a few sketches on the base. I sketched out a line where the railway ballast would end, and I also marked the position for the mini art water crane that I've shown you in my second video. After I did all this, I placed the railway car with the FW-190 on top of the tracks and also placed the FW-190 wing on the railway platform, and at that moment I noticed that it's way too small. Both ends of the FW-190 wing stood out way too much over the base, and I didn't like the overall appearance. It looked too crowded, without any detail already, so I decided to go for a bigger base. So let's continue with this base, and that's quite a lot bigger than the one I've shown you before. I wanted to create a grassy embankment in the foreground of the diorama. Unfortunately I wasn't able to find my X-Acto knife, so I had to use a single blade for this task. I prefer to use an X-Acto knife for this task over a hot wire foam cutter, since I feel like the X-Acto knife gives me a lot more control than the foam cutter would do. There was one big problem with my last diorama with the railway tank car. When I fixed the railroad ballast in place with gravel and sand fixer and came back a few hours later, I always noticed that the railway ballast would sit way deeper in the tracks and on the base than it did before. For some reason I didn't have in mind that the enamel-based gravel and sand fixer is able to damage this styrofoam. To counter this problem I used AK Interactive foam sealer and covered almost the whole base with this stuff as a protection layer against enamel effects and all that nasty stuff that is able to dissolve XPS foam. As you can see, I also used small foam offcuts and pushed them into the holes I made earlier for the templates, so that I had a more or less even ground for the later steps. When I remove the masking tape in a few seconds, you will also notice that there's an area in the foreground that didn't receive any foam sealer. At this point in time, I still had the idea to place a larger sheet of concrete in that area for the water crane to sit on, but I decided otherwise a few steps later. Normally before I start a project like this, I like to do quite a detailed sketch of the finished scene, but for me it's also okay to deviate from that sketch when I noticed in a later step that I didn't like anything I just did or that something would look way better. The railway tracks you can see me assembling here came from the Saber models kit for the Plattformwagen. If you watched my first video, you might remember that I had to order a second kit. And that was great, since I had more track available, and when I noticed that the first base was way too small, I had to get out a third piece of track to get the right length over the bigger base. Assembling those railway tracks was quite fun, since they go together so well. You can see there are also small hooks on between each sleeper, so if you want to show a curved scene, you're able to hook those together and you get a nice curve for your model to stand on. But since I had this train station scene in mind, I had to use a straight piece of track, and I used a ruler to make sure that the track would sit straight on the diorama. The assembled track then was glued to the base using some wood or PVA glue. I could have used super glue, but I like to use wood glue for tasks like that, since it gives me a lot more time to adjust the final position of the track. When I placed the railway track on top of the base, I paid close attention to the edges of the base. I made sure to get a piece of track on the edge that can be cut off nicely in a later step. I used my sprue cutters and a razor saw to cut off the unnecessary pieces of railway track that stood over the edge. The fine-tuning then was done using my rotary tool and a nail file. I wanted to make sure to cut the excess railway track as close as possible to the edge of the diorama base. This is also a lesson learned from my last project with the tank car. I cut off a little too much of the railway sleeper at one edge, and I had to do quite a lot of remodeling using green stuff epoxy putty to recreate the shape of the railway sleeper so it would sit flush against the wooden veneer that I added later. I really like to do those first steps when building a diorama, cutting out the form and doing the rough cut to get everything into shape. Those tasks are quite easy and also quite fast, and they motivate me a lot to keep going when building a diorama. I wanted to add a large area of concrete on the railway platform, and the best material for concrete in my opinion is a large sheet of cork. I cut that cork into shape using an X-Acto blade. Again, I wasn't able to find the whole X-Acto knife, and also the template I created for cutting the styrofoam for the railway platform into shape. After I cut out the general shape, I also marked in the position of the shed that will sit on the edge of the railway platform. I decided to cut away the cork in that area. That way the shed will sit a little sunken into the concrete, if you will, and it's easier to get a nice and clean edge around the shed this way in my opinion. I used a 4mm thick piece of cork for this task. I would have liked to use a 2mm thick sheet, but unfortunately my hardware store only offered the 4mm one. After all the cuts were done, it was time for the most fun task in the whole concrete process. I used a cheap acrylic putty from the hardware store and spread it in a thick layer all over the sheet of cork. This stuff is quite cheap and lightweight and normally used to fill holes in walls in your flat, but I like to use it for concrete. I spread it over the whole surface using a spatula, and after that you are able to smooth it out using just your fingers and a bit of tap water. After everything was smooth, I set aside this piece of concrete so it can dry. In the past I tried placing it on my radiator for it to dry faster, but unfortunately that warped the cork a lot. But to be fair, this stuff only takes an hour for it to dry, so it's quite fast anyway. After it was dry, I removed the excess and broke it off just using my fingers. Now we get to the second best part of creating concrete, breaking it all apart. I mean adding realistic cracks. So this stuff cracks quite easily when you bend the cork, but the cork will stay in shape. You can sometimes break it apart if you use a little too much force, but that isn't a problem either. The putty then cracks in a quite realistic way. It's hard to see at this point in time where it's still white, but you can see it later. So I feel like after every fun task, there's one that is way worse, and we are at this point now. I wanted the front of the railway platform made out of bricks, and I needed to recreate those and model them into the styrofoam. The first step was to cut a lot of grooves that were parallel to each other and 2 mm spaced apart along the railway platform. As you can see, I used a ruler for that and a razor blade that is glued to a piece of plastic to get a nice and perpendicular cut. You might also notice that this piece of styrofoam changes in the next shot, and that's because I did a mistake just before I reached the end and I had to redo all this. Luckily styrofoam is cheap and I like to torture myself, so I started all over. After all those cuts were made, I used my mechanical pencil to widen those. The lead of the mechanical pencil glides really smooth through the styrofoam and leaves a nice and soft edge. After that I started to cut all the vertical gaps between those bricks. I did an alternating pattern with 4 mm and 8 mm white bricks, since I've seen this in my reference pictures. You might also notice that the fiberboard templates are still bolted to my styrofoam. This way I was able to push all my tools against the fiberboard and I didn't risk to damage the styrofoam. Also, it was way easier to place it onto my table this way, and I did the final cutout for the backside after all the bricks were shaped. After all those cuts were made, I went back to my mechanical pencil to widen all those gaps and also to smooth out every single brick. Creating brickwork this way takes quite a lot of time and patience, but the result is well worth it. This is by far the largest brickwall I ever created and I'm really proud of it, I have to say. I'm quite critical with my own work when I notice any imperfections, when the lines aren't straight and stuff like that. And on this wall everything is straight and every brick is where it's supposed to be. After I cut the platform into shape, as you just saw, I went back to my AK Interactive foam texturizer and sealer. I added some dark grey acrylic paint and quite a lot of tap water and mixed it all together until I had a smooth mixture. The dark grey paint isn't really necessary, but I decided to add it so this mixture shows better on camera against the also lightly colored foam. I made this mixture very thin, almost like water, so it was able to seep into all those cracks and gaps between the single bricks. This mixture serves two purposes. For one, it makes the styrofoam immune against enamel thinner and enamel paints, and it also smooths out the foam texture. Then it was time to glue the concrete patches into place on the railway platform. I again used just cheap wood glue for that task. As you can see, I also broke apart the cork sheet even more to recreate some really large and wide gaps and cracks in the concrete. I placed the sheet of cork first where the house would sit, so the house will fit nicely in its place, and then I used the foremost edge of the railway platform as a guide to glue in the rest, since it was way easier to cut off the axis in the back than in the front where I just carefully shaped all those small bricks. After the concrete patches were in place, I put the whole assembly to the side for it to dry. Wood glue sometimes has quite a lot of drying time when used on XPS foam, since the foam isn't able to soak up any moisture from the glue. After the cork patches were firmly in place, I then proceeded to glue the whole railway platform in place on the bigger base. I then set the whole assembly to the side so it could dry overnight. Gluing styrofoam to styrofoam using wood glue takes even more time than gluing cork to styrofoam, since there's no way for the water in the glue to evaporate. I used the drying time to look for my X-Acto knife so I can cut the excess off using a whole knife and not just a single blade. After I cut most of it away, I then sanded the rest flat with the XPS foam. I'm not sure if I said that creating the bricks in the styrofoam was the worst part of this diorama. If I said that, I'm sorry, that was a lie. Gluing the wooden veneer to the styrofoam was for real the worst part of this diorama. I used Crowdtech fast drying basing glue for this task. This stuff is a lot like PVA glue, but it stays tacky after it dried. I covered the whole foam surface with it and then used it as kind of a contact adhesive after it dried for a couple of hours. Gluing wooden veneer to a styrofoam base is normally not that big of a problem, but those big oval bases take quite a lot of patience. Since I have to glue it against the wood grain, there's quite a lot of tension on the wooden veneer, and you have to be careful to not break it before it's even glued to the surface. One of the big advantages of that Crowdtech basing glue is that it's water soluble even after it dried. So when you mess up at this point, it's quite easy to remove the wooden veneer and dissolve the glue by using water waiver. I like to make sure to have a lot of excess veneer when covering a round base like this, since it's a lot easier to cut everything into shape after it's glued to the base than gluing a perfectly fitted piece of wood veneer to a base like this. It's then quite easy to cut off the excess using scissors and X-Acto knives. The only point where I had to be quite careful were the edges of the railway platform, and I used a razor knife so the wooden veneer wouldn't break apart at that edge. As you can see, I still left some excess veneer at the top of the diorama. And this way I was able to fill in the gap with even more of the putty I used earlier to recreate the concrete. And I also was able to use it as a fence, if you want to say it like that, for doing the herb in the foremost part of the diorama. After the gap was mostly filled with putty, I smoothed out the stuff again using some tap water and my finger. This putty dries quite fast even when it's applied quite thick, and it took maybe half an hour to an hour for it to dry. While the putty was drying, I focused on the lower edge of the diorama. I cut it roughly into shape using a small scissor and then sanded everything smooth. To be honest, this clip is just a rough representation of what I did while sanding it, since I went outside for that to not create a lot of dust in my living room. I then also glued in place this small concrete slab where the water crane would sit on later. And then it was time for the railway ballast. It was quite hard to find railway ballast in 1/35 scale, but luckily AK Interactive got me covered with that one. Unfortunately, that stuff is quite expensive and comes in a small package. So already when I did the last diorama, I visited my local hobby shop for railway modeling and bought a big bottle of cheap railway ballast. This stuff is way too small and doesn't look any good, but I use it as a base layer for the AK Interactive railway ballast, so I only had to use that stuff for the topmost layer. Since I had that bad experience with the gravel and sand fixer on the last diorama, and I also used the foam sealer as a protection layer, I also used watered down PVA glue to glue the basic railway ballast into place, so I get an even thicker protection layer before the foam starts. And then it was again time for a fun task, putting down VMS Smart Mud for the groundwork. I really like this stuff because it looks so tasty. Because it's easy to apply. It's somewhere between a putty and a modeling clay and sticks really well to the surface. And it's easy to make imprints for tracks and stuff like that. Even if it wasn't necessary here, I like to use it as a base layer. After applying it all over the surface using a spatula, I then used my finger to tap it down a little and bring it more into shape. I made sure to also cover the gap between the foam and the wooden veneer in the front using that Smart Mud. While that stuff had to dry for a couple of hours, I went back to the railway tracks and the railroad ballast. I used the AK stuff to create a top layer on the cheap gravel I laid down earlier. At this point I was again quite happy that I used the cheap gravel as a base layer, since even with that I had to use like 3 bottles of that AK railroad gravel. After I put down most of the gravel using a wooden spoon, I then went in with a brush and tweezers to do the detail work. When that was done, I started to fix everything in place. I used AK gravel and sand fixer for this task. Watered down PVA glue would have been another option, but sometimes you can see it after it dried, and the gravel and sand fixer is the better option in my opinion. This task was quite enjoyable since it looked so cool when the gravel changed its color. Also, next time I'll do something like this I will be even more careful. Everything was sealed using that AK Interactive foam texturizer and sealer, but in a few areas I still got some damage from the enamel thinner on the brick wall. Let's do some more groundwork. I sprinkled some earth over the dried smart mud and also added some small gravel for good measure. Smart mud is great to establish the general shape of the groundwork, but it does not have the most realistic texture, so adding some earth and gravel is a good way to counteract that. This stuff was then once again fixed into place using AK Interactive Gravel and Sand Fixer. As I said before, I like to do the groundwork before I cut the wooden veneer into its final shape. This way the smart mud is able to fill in some gaps, and it's, in my opinion, quite a lot easier to cut the wood veneer to a shape that matches the groundwork perfectly. So after the basic groundwork was done, I removed the excess veneer that was still left. I removed the main parts using a small scissor and then used my hobby knife for the detailing. I like to make the edge between the groundwork and the wooden veneer as smooth as possible. So after the veneer was cut into shape, I went back in using the smart mud to fill in any small holes I could spot. While doing this, you have to be quite careful to not get the smart mud onto your wooden veneer, since its brown color is able to stain the wood. For the edges between the wooden veneer and the brick wall on the railway platform, I again used the putty that I used before to create the concrete. I made sure to fill the gap completely and then went back in with my mechanical pencil to re-establish the gaps that I just closed off with the putty. And again, everything was smoothed out using my finger dipped in tap water. While you watch me fill in the gaps, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for all the amazing support in 2024. When I started YouTube in October, I didn't think that my videos will get so many views and that I will get so many subscribers so fast, and I'm very grateful for that. So thank you all for watching my videos, and I hope that you enjoy this one as much as you enjoyed the other videos. After those gaps all looked nice and clean, I then focused on the seam line of the back of the diorama where the wooden veneer meets. I used oak colored wood putty to fill it in and then sanded everything smooth. Again, this created quite a lot of dust, so there's no video footage about it since I did it outdoors to not ruin my living room completely. Then I focused again on the concrete. The front side of the concrete patch wasn't covered in putty yet, and since I already had it at hand, I just did this also real quick. I smeared it with putty and then again smoothed everything out with tap water and my finger. Then it was time for some paint. Normally I like to build everything, then prime it and paint everything all in one go, but for this project I decided on another procedure. I decided to paint the brick wall before I add any vegetation in the foreground, so there's zero chance of me destroying any of that vegetation while painting the brick wall in the back. This meant that I had to do some masking later and that I had to be careful to not get any overspray on the already painted brick wall, but in the end I think it was worth it since I was able to rest my hand on the railway tracks and on the groundwork. I painted the bricks using a bunch of brick-colored AK Interactive 3rd generation acrylics. I thinned my paint down to almost a glaze consistency, so I got a few different hues all over the surface. While I painted the bricks, I closely observed my reference pictures to recreate the different patterns in the brickwork you can see here. For the next step, I tested quite a bunch of white powders. I wanted to recreate the mortar between those bricks. I tried to use putty for that in the past, but I figured out that using AK Interactive snow micro balloons is the best way in my opinion. As you can see, I just put it on the bricks and then used a brush to brush it into the gaps between those bricks. Those micro balloons are quite fine, but the single particles are large enough so that they don't stick to the surface of the bricks itself. As I said, I tested quite a lot of white powders and the micro balloons were the best option in my opinion. They are quite fine and sit nice in the gaps between the single bricks, but they are large enough so that they don't stick to the surface of the brick like finer powder often does. The micro balloons were then fixed into place using AK Interactive Gravel and Sand Fixer. When you cover them with Gravel and Sand Fixer, they sink in a little, and if you like an even coverage all over your brick wall, you might want to do a second pass. But I liked the result after my first pass already. Since the micro balloons are pure white, I then used my AK Interactive enamel dust effects to paint the mortar between the bricks in a more grayish dusty color that looked more natural. Then it was finally time for vegetation. I used some bigger grass tufts and bushes to cover all the damage I had done with the enamel thinner on the brick wall, and I also placed quite a lot of small grass tufts between the railroad ballast. Again, I looked at a bunch of reference pictures I found in the internet or took myself to recreate an authentic looking railway track. I also had a leftover bush from my last project, so I decided to use it here. I drilled a hole and stuck it into place without any glue, so I can still remove it for easier painting. Then it was time for another fun task, static grass. I again used Crowdtech fast drying basing glue and brushed it onto the groundwork in irregular patterns. I then loaded my static grass applicator with different lengths of static grass to recreate some nice and grassy patches in the foreground. I recently switched from my homemade static grass applicator to the Woodland Scenics Static King and I'm really satisfied with the change. It's not cheap, but the result is well worth it for me. I also have another project planned for this year where the Static King will come in very handy, but I will let you know about this project soon. After a few passes with the static grass applicator, I brought out my small modeling table vacuum to remove the excess static grass that wasn't glued to the base itself. The small vacuum is also one of the tools I don't want to miss at my modeling bench. It helps to keep the modeling bench quite a lot cleaner and I really like that. While the glue that was used for the static grass was still wet, I also started to sprinkle some earth over the grassy patches to create an even more natural look. And I also used some AK Interactive sea ball to spread some vegetation and small scatter material all over. I normally would use Gravel and Sand Fixer to fix this stuff into place, but that day I also visited one of my favorite modeling shops and got myself a bottle of Crowdcover Scenics Crowd Fixer. It's supposed to do the same thing as Gravel and Sand Fixer, but it's not enamel based, and I have to say I quite like it. One of the biggest advantages is that it's quite a lot cheaper than Gravel and Sand Fixer for a way bigger bottle. I also added a bunch of flowers and other grass tufts and shrooms between the static grass to create an even more natural looking vegetation. Creating the vegetation is also one of the parts I like most while building dioramas. It's so much fun to me to see it come all together and add the grass tuft by tuft and layers of static grass. It's just so much fun. I also cut down a cheap paintbrush that I keep for adding longer weeds, and then I also decided to do a very small tree made from sea foam. And since a single piece of sea foam looks quite boring, I then added a bunch of leaves one by one. I also did this for a much larger tree for my last diorama, It may took a lot of time, but in the end it was really worth the effort. You can also see the railway car in the upper left edge with the FW-190 placed on top. I placed it onto the diorama at this step to make sure that the tree won't obscure any detail on the model itself. And then it was finally time for more paint. I used my favorite primers, Mr. Hobby Surfacer 1500 in black and Mr. Mahogany Surfacer, to cover the whole base. Some might say that the static grass and the grass tufts already looked fine, but I like to paint everything to get a more uniform and coherent look all over, and to match the color of the grass to the picture I had of the finished model in my mind. And then it was time to paint the grass. I did this with a bunch of paints from Tamiya and the AK Real Color range. I started out with a NATO green as a nice and dark base layer for the grass. After everything was covered in NATO green, I then got out my favorite green paint, Protective 4BO from the AK Real Color range, to add in some lighter spots all over the grass. The grass already looked really fine after this step, but I then started to add some Tamiya yellow green to my Protective 4BO paint to get even more and brighter spots in the grass. When building military models, you work with a lot of muted colors, but I decided that I wanted to try something more vibrant in this case, and I think I have to try something even more vibrant in one of the next projects. As you can see, I also painted all the small grass tufts between the railroad gravel using my airbrush. Since the gravel will be painted at a later step, the overspray wasn't a problem here as well. Time for another favorite color of mine, Tamiya German Yellow. I added this in a few areas to recreate the little more dried out grass in some spots. When I was happy with the outcome, I switched my airbrush to Tamiya Deck 10 and base coated all the railroad gravel. I did this very carefully to not get too much overspray on the grass tufts. I didn't mind a little overspray since it looked like dust on the grass, and I figured this would be a very common thing in reality. And then I sprayed all the earthy parts with Tamiya Flat Earth as sort of a base coat. Then I focused again on the railway track itself. My favorite color for dark steel surfaces is German Grey. I used Tamiya German Grey and airbrushed the railway track itself with it. I used this large white piece of styrene as a mask to not get too much overspray onto the rest of the diorama. Of course, the railway track still isn't finished yet. I later came in with a lot of enamel paints to bring out the highlights a lot more. But first I focused on this small piece of concrete in the foreground. I used a bunch of grays and stippled those on using a small sponge, and then I did a quick wash with burnt umber from the Scale 75 Artist Acrylics range. And as you know, I like to highlight every tiny bit of detail, and I use Deck 10 for that. When I do the larger piece of concrete on the railway platform, I will talk more about my approach to painting concrete. When that small concrete patch was finished, I then focused again on the groundwork. The ground itself was painted using a bunch of different AK Interactive enamel effects. Enamel effects can be wet blended quite easily. This way you get a smooth transition between different colors. I tried to focus the darker ones around the grass and between the grass tufts, and the lighter ones more in the middle, so I get some fake lights and shadows, if you want to call it like that. I also really like my enamel effects for painting vegetation itself. In this case I used Slimy Grime Light to paint the leaves on the small tree and also for the trunk of this small tree. Those enamel effects flow quite nicely around details and into crevices, so they are my first option when I need to paint some small grass tufts or leaves on a small tree. And since I already talked about enamel effects, I also used a black panel line wash from AK Interactive and did a nice and dark wash all over the railroad gravel. And I also like to use enamel effects in my airbrush, and I used them to spray a light coat of rust all over the railway tracks. But of course I also went in with a brush and some darker rust streaks to create even more shadows and a more rusty spot on the railway track and around the bolts that mount the track itself to the sleepers. Speaking of those railway sleepers, those were then brush painted using acrylics from the Scale 75 artist range. Those artist acrylics from Scale 75 stay wet a lot longer than other acrylics. That's why I used them for almost all my wood painting. I started with a darker color and then immediately can blend a lighter color over the surface, and I get a really natural look this way. Of course, you could also use oil paints for that, but those acrylics dry a lot faster, so this is my option of choice. And then it was time to add some weathering to the brick wall itself. I used AK Interactive moss deposits and dust effects for that. Those enamel paints again are really nice to blend with enamel thinner all over the surface and give a natural look. I really like the moss effect since it's kind of a vibrant green that really adds some pop to the brick wall itself. On the other hand, I wasn't that happy with the dust effects. They toned down the brick colors a lot all over the surface. So after I was finished with them, I came back in with my brick acrylics I used earlier and glazed some of those orange and red colors over a few bricks to give them a little more pop and to add back in some of those brick colors. After I did that, I was quite happy with the result. Adding in those colors added a lot of pop to the brick wall and also created more natural looking variation all over the wall, and I really liked the outcome so far. Remember when I told you earlier that my idea was to finish the brick wall completely before I start adding vegetation so I don't damage anything? I somehow lost track of that idea and I had to be really careful at this point to not damage any of the already painted vegetation. But it went fine, for the most part. Then I glued in the already painted base plate of the water crane. If you haven't seen the water crane video yet, I'll post a link to that in the description of this video. The small gap between the base plate and the surrounding concrete then got filled in with fine earth again. I then used gravel and sand fixer to fix it into place, and of course I also used my trusty earthy enamel effects to paint that earth as well. After that it was time for another fun task, painting the railway ballast. With the airbrush deck tan paint and the enamel wash I've shown you earlier, I already induced quite a lot of variation in the gravel. I then picked out a few random grays I liked and started to paint single stones. I took one color and went all over the complete ballast, then I took the next color and went again all over the complete ballast. This took quite a while, but it was a fun task, and in my opinion it really adds a lot of natural variation to the railroad ballast and looks way better this way. Unfortunately, in the end, most of that painted gravel will be covered with the flatbed car sitting on top of it. If you do stuff like this, in my opinion it's quite important to not get overboard with your color selection. Just pick maybe 3 to 4 grayish paints and then go ahead. Don't overcomplicate things. At this point I also painted the gravel that was found in the earth all around the railway track. And while I already had my paintbrush and my wet palette at hand, I also decided to take the opportunity and highlight the nuts and bolts on the railway track. As you probably know by now, I'm quite a fan of highlighting every small detail, and of course I did this on this diorama as well. After that was done, I brought out the yellow paint I already used on the FW-190 to paint the yellow flowers I placed earlier on the model and then airbrushed completely green. Using the same yellow that I used already on the airplane, make sure that all the colors in the whole piece match each other and that there's sort of a coherent paint scheme, if you want to call it like that. Then it was finally time to focus on the small house that will sit on the diorama. As you can see, I again did a quick sketch and then transferred the sketch to another XPS foam block. After the sketch was done, I also mounted the templates I've shown you earlier with a few small nails to the foam block. Again, I used the hard edges of those templates as a guide for my knife and my ruler in the later steps. I had the idea to make this house out of bricks that are covered in plaster, so I marked the areas where the exposed bricks will sit, and the rest of it will be covered in plaster in a later step. And while you watch me do some basic construction work on this block of XPS foam, I'd like to take the time to make a small announcement. After the last two videos, I got asked quite a lot if there's something like a Patreon channel where you can see a lot more of my work. The answer to this question was no, until today. Since today there is actually a Patreon channel where you can see more of my work and got a few benefits in exchange for supporting my work. I will upload way more high quality photos to my Patreon. You also will get access to all the 3D details I designed for my models, and you will get 1 week early and ad-free videos. And of course we can use Patreon to get in contact with each other. You can ask me questions about modeling or everything else. And I would be entirely grateful if you would check out my Patreon account. You can find the link to my Patreon in the channel description. Thank you so much in advance. And now we got that out of the way, let's get back to this house. Doing the brickwork on this model was a lot easier than doing the brickwork on the railway platform, since all those areas were a lot smaller and it was easier to keep everything in line and in shape. The only area where I had to pay close attention to what I did was the edge of the building, so the single bricks were in the right orientation from both sides. At this point I wasn't really sure what I will do with the door and the window, so I removed quite a lot of material to be safe in the later steps. I then used a metal ruler to push down the brickwork, so the parts that will be covered in plaster later are higher up and will stand out from the brickwork even more. After I pushed everything down using that metal ruler, I also used my hobby knife to make a cut on the edge, and then I used a small spatula to deepen this cut a little more and create an even more three-dimensional shape, if you want to say it like that. This step was a little nerve-wracking since I liked the brickwork already so much and I was quite careful to not damage anything. And then it was once again time to bring out the AK Interactive Foam Texturizer and Sealer. I made a new batch of the mixture I've shown you earlier while doing the brickwork for the railway platform, and again I mixed in some grey paint so you can see it better here. I'm not sure if I did 2 or 3 passes on the brick wall, but it doesn't hurt to do a little more. After that stuff was dry, I used some masking tape to cover the edges where the exposed brick will lay, and also used the foam texturizer and sealer to recreate the stucco on the other surfaces. And also once again, tap water and my finger were the best tool to get everything smooth. I immediately removed the masking tape while the foam texturizer was still wet, so there was a 0% chance that I would damage the texturizer when it was dry. And then it was time for more cracks, but this time on the plaster rather than the concrete. I again took a look at a few reference pictures and then marked out the positions of the cracks on the foam texturizer. And while the foam texturizer is great for reinforcing the styrofoam, you still should be quite careful when marking in the positions, since too much pressure can still damage the foam and the texturizer as well. I then started carving the cracks in the foam texturizer. I used my hobby knife for that with the blade sideways, so I get a more uneven finish on both edges. The foam texturizer crumbles quite nicely, so I already, with just some basic carving, got a really convincing look on those cracks. Unfortunately it's hard to see on camera, but even without any paint it looked already quite good. I then also used my hobby knife to crumble the edges of the plaster a little more to get a more realistic look. When all the cracks were in place, I then again brought out my hot wire foam cutter and used the templates I have shown you earlier and that were already placed on the styrofoam block to cut out the round shape at the back of this house. To be honest, this worked way better than I expected, and after I did this cut, the house almost fitted perfectly on the base already. After I did this cut, I removed the templates, and I also took the house and used a few nails to put it together with the part I just cut off, since a nice square block of styrofoam is way easier to work with than one that has a weird round shape at the back. I then also fixed a few more cutting templates, or cutting guides if you want to call it like that, to the styrofoam block to cut out the general shape of the roof. This technique worked great and way better than I expected, to be honest. And after I did all those cuts, I ended up with a house with a nicely cut roof and a perfectly cut backside. I imagined the roof to be made out of corrugated metal, and this is the first time I'll use my 3D printer in this project. I found this nice tool on Thingiverse that is used to bring thin pieces of metal into a corrugated shape. I had to rescale it a bit to fit the 1/35 scale, but that wasn't that big of a deal. After the metal embossing foil from the arts and crafts store was pinned into shape, I again used PVA glue to fix it in place. Adding the corrugated metal to the roof took quite a while, since the PVA glue needed quite a long time to dry. After it was dry, I used a sharp razor blade to cut off the excess before I added the next layer of corrugated metal. I tried a few different methods of removing the excess metal foil on the back of the house, and the razor blade seemed to be the best option. It still did some damage to the corrugated metal, but it wasn't that bad. The ridge of the roof also was made from a small piece of metal foil, but in this case I used super glue to glue it to the corrugated metal, since there wasn't any risk of damaging the underlying styrofoam. Then it was time to glue some more wood veneer into place, in this case on the backside of the house. This was way easier than gluing the big piece of veneer to the lower part of the base, and I was quite happy about that. Again, excess wood veneer got cut into shape using a small scissor, and then I used my rotary tool to bring it perfectly into the shape of the corrugated metal. Unfortunately, while doing that, I did some damage to the corrugated metal roof, and I had to redo it. After the new sheets were glued in place, I then again used the oak-colored wood putty to fill in any leftover gaps between the wood veneer and the corrugated metal. For the edges on the side, I again brought out the putty I've shown you earlier when I filled in the edges between the wood veneer and the brick wall on the railway platform. The gable of the house will be made from wooden planks. Well, not really wooden planks, but a styrene shade that will look like wooden planks. I used my steel wire brush to brush in the wood grain texture, and then used my engraving tool to engrave single wood planks into the bigger sheet of styrene. I then cut everything into shape using my small table saw and also my Vallejo scriber. I also added some damage to the underside, so the wooden planks will look a little different from each other, and then I covered everything with a layer of Tamiya extra thin quick cement to dissolve any leftover plastic fuss and get a more uniform surface. That's more or less the same technique I used 2 videos ago when I did the wooden transport racks for the FW-190. If you watched that video, this will also look familiar to you. I added a bunch of nail heads. I punched them out of thin aluminum foil and glued them into place. Last time I used black superglue for this task, and since the last video I also discovered that Tamiya extra thin cement can also be used to glue those into place. And to be fair, they aren't really glued, but if you push them in hard enough, they will stick to the plastic. The door and the window were also made from styrene sheet. I googled for reference pictures of steel doors and steel window frames and found a few that I quite liked. For the door, I just glued a few different size sheets of styrene onto each other until it matched my reference picture, and then I added a few details I designed and 3D printed, like the door lock and the hinges on the backside of the door. The door handle itself was made from copper wire, since it's a lot easier to bend something like this out of wire than 3D printing it. Then it was time for a quick test fit, and luckily the door perfectly fit into the cutout in the house. I then decided that the window shutters will be closed and that they will be a little skewed. I glued different pieces of styrene sheet onto each other, and again I 3D printed the hinges for the window shutters. After one of the last videos I also got asked why I always print so many parts if I only need a few of them. 3D printed parts that are that small are quite easy to break while removing them from the supports, so I like to print a few extra spare bits, and if I don't need them they go to my spares box, to my storage box, and if I find use for them in a later project I already have them at hand. Speaking of spares, since I also had a few hundred rivets from the FW-190 project left, I decided to use those as nail heads for the corrugated metal roof. For those I again used my black superglue and then removed the excess with superglue debonder. This barely visible stuff is a VMS metal prep. I added it to the metal roof to make sure that the paint in the later steps will adhere nicely to the thin metal sheets. When I look out of my kitchen window I can see a corrugated metal roof with quite a lot of moss on it. I really like the look of it, so I decided to also do this for this model. After all the grass tufts were in place, it was finally prime time again, and I used Black Mr. Surfacer 1500 to prime the corrugated metal roof, and while I was already at it I also used the Black Mr. Surfacer to prime the door and the window and also the wooden gable. After I primed all those parts I still had some Mr. Surfacer left in the cup of my airbrush, so I also used this opportunity to prime the rest of the house as well. I then started out for the roof with a layer of Vallejo metallic color. I kept the pressure of my airbrush quite low, so I ended up with a little more uneven and sputtery surface. The idea behind this is to introduce a little bit of surface texture, which I find crucial for large flat areas like this one. I then switched to Tamiya German Grey to darken the metal a little and introduce the first layer of dirt. After that I went right to my enamel paints, and I used AK Interactive medium rust deposits through my airbrush to create the first layer of rust. For the shadowed areas the medium rust deposits are way too light, so I also used the enamel rust streaks to create some darker areas. And you guessed it, after I started working with enamels I also brought back out the odorless thinner to blend the rusty areas over the surface. Painting this roof was a lot of trial and error for me, since it's my first time painting something like this. After the first airbrushed layers of rust I also went back in with my brush and the darker rust effects to create even more shadows and rust streaks all over the surface. And after that step I still found the surface quite flat looking, so I went back in with enamel streaking effects to create way darker shadows in the areas where the plates overlap. And to create even more shadows I then used the winter streaking grime to create darker areas between the single ridges and also in the areas where the single plates overlap. And then I started to focus on the moss on the roof. I told you before in this video that I like to use enamel effects like slimy grime light and moss deposits to paint vegetation, and that also was the perfect approach for the moss on the roof. And after I painted the larger pieces of moss I also started to introduce a few moss deposits all over the roof. I rarely work with a speckling technique, but I thought why not give it a try on this roof to create more surface texture, and I tried to speckle the rust effects all over the roof. I should have tried it on a spare model first. I ended up with quite big drops of paint and I had to go back in with the enamel thinner to blend them in and make them less prominent. The patches of moss were painted in the first go around with slimy grime light and after that highlighted with the moss deposits. I also did a pin wash around the nail heads or rivets I glued to the roof with a black pin wash. The nail heads weren't highlighted yet, but you can already see that adding a dark pin wash around the metallic surface is a great way to increase your contrast. But of course I also went back in with a light metallic color and highlighted every single nail head on that roof. I really love to see how those tiny details pop after you highlighted them and gave them a black pin wash. That's something I prefer for all my models. And after that I sealed everything in with AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. Now it's time for the greatest painting tool of all times, a piece of sponge. Large flat areas like the sidewalls or this house or the concrete patches are quite blunt detail-wise. Of course there are a few cracks and uneven areas, but in my opinion you need to introduce a lot of visual texture to make them interesting to look at. And the sponge is a great way to do that. I picked a bunch of beige and grayish colors and started to sponge them all over the surface. I started out with a light base coat, more or less all over, and then I used a few grayish, reddish and beige tones to introduce some variation to the surface. I will later also use this technique for the large piece of concrete on the railway platform, and I think the effect is even more noticeable on that area. After that it was time for brick painting again. Painting those bricks is quite a simple task. When the gaps between the bricks aren't filled in yet, it's quite easy to keep your paint where it's supposed to be. Again, I picked a bunch of reddish and orange colors and started to paint random patterns all over the surface. You have to be careful when painting the edge, so bricks that are visible from both sides receive the same color. And after all those bricks were painted, it was again time for a bit of white powder. When I did the brickwall for the platform, I told you that I only did one pass with the micro balloons and the gravel and sand fixer, and for the house I actually did a second pass to create a more even filling in the gaps between the single bricks. And then I started to paint the details. I started out with the gable, and again I used my scale 75 artist acrylics for that. I base coated everything with burnt umber and then went back in with a bunch of lighter colors to create some texture all over the surface. Those colors are very easy to blend, as you can see here, and with the actual texture introduced by the wire brush all over the plastic surface, this kinda looks very realistic. I didn't spend too much time on the gable at this point, because I decided to try some chipping effects. I covered everything with a layer of chipping fluid, and then I started to airbrush in some bluish grey paints. I like to keep my paint scheme over the whole project coherent, so the colors I used here to highlight the bluish grey gable were also used on the underwing surface of the FW-190. When I was done with the airbrushing and post shading, I used a stiff paintbrush and some tap water to reactivate the chipping fluid and create some weathered effects all over the wooden gable. I also don't use chipping fluid often, but this time I really liked it. The effect I created was quite convincing in my opinion. I haven't shown this to you yet, but I also created a piece of wooden planks for the side to go under the roof. And then I glued in both pieces using PVA glue. And then I did quite a heavy enamel wash over the whole gable. One thing I wasn't too happy about is that the chipping fluid filled in a lot of the recesses on the wooden parts. Since that happened, it wasn't that easy to do a pin wash over the wooden surface, so I opted for a heavy wash all over to bring back some shadows. And after that it was again time for a pin wash, this time using the AK Interactive Rust Streaks, and of course I blended those also over the surface using the enamel thinner. And of course doing a pin wash isn't enough for me, so I also highlighted every single nail head on the wooden gable and also on the wooden piece that I glued to the side of the house. And to be honest, that wasn't really necessary since nothing of the wooden piece is visible in the end, since it's so deep in the shadows. And again, time for even more highlights. I used an off-white color to highlight the edges of all the individual planks on the wooden gable to really separate them from each other. And since the roof seems to be so rusty and leaky, I also introduced a few moss stains on the wooden gable. After those areas were mostly finished, I started to work on the door and the window shutters. I base coated them in Tamiya German grey because at this point in time I had in mind that I maybe use chipping fluid on them as well, but I went without the chipping fluid. But as I said, I like German grey as a base coat for dark steel surfaces, so I didn't mind the German grey showing through in the end. I then used a bunch of green paints to base coat and post shade the door again. Since it's also a big flat surface, I tried to introduce some visual texture with the post shading and to make the paint a little bit uneven. In the end, I also added some deck tan to my green paint to create some lighter areas on the door. And after the basic paint job was finished, it was time for a lot of chipping effects. Again, I looked at a bunch of reference pictures I took myself for fun on the internet and used a bunch of AK Interactive 3rd generation acrylics to paint chipping on the door and also on the window, as you can see later. After the first round of chipping effects, I then did a black pin wash around the whole door to create even more dark shadows. As you can see, I also added in a red warning sign I found on the decal sheet of the FW-190. To be honest, the writing on it isn't really accurate for a door like this, but it's so small that it's not even possible to read. Also, another fun fact, there are quite a bunch of spelling errors in that sign, so I didn't use it for the FW-190. And then it was time for rust effects again. I used the darker rust streaks and the lighter medium rust deposits to introduce even more rust and chipping effects on the whole door. And of course I brought out the lighter color to edge highlight the whole door. And this made sure that the separate layers of the metal door frame are clearly visible. I also highlighted all the small bolts on the door lock. I had quite a lot of fun scratch building the door and the window as well. It's a great feeling to start out with some blunt sheets of plastic and then create something that really looks like a door. And it amazes me almost every time. I then did a quick test fit again to see how it looked and later glued the door in place using PVA glue. And then it was time to focus on the window and the window shutters. Again, I told you that I used the same colors I used for the door also for the window, so no need to show it here. And then I also went back in and did a few chipping effects all over the whole window, closely following reference pictures. Painting in every single chip by hand looks like a quite tedious process, but honestly it really isn't. It took me maybe 1.5 hours to paint all the chipping on the window and the door. The painting techniques I employed on the window are basically the same techniques I already used on the door. So again, I would like to take a moment to thank you for all your amazing supports in the last videos. And if you like this video, maybe subscribe to my channel, give this video a like and write a comment which detail you like the most from the finished piece. And I would be very thankful for that. And again, if you think the hinges on the window or on the door or the door lock look amazing, then you might want to check out my Patreon. The files for your 3D printer are available on my Patreon for you to download, and you can use them for your own projects. And of course I added a few nuts and bolts to the hinges that are so small that they are barely visible. So again, it's important to highlight those so you can see them in the end product. And the window also was glued in using PVA glue. This was a little bit more tedious than gluing in the door, since the fit was quite tight, but I was really happy about the end result. I'm not sure, have I already told you how much I like enamel effects? I employed a lot of them on the other surfaces of the house. I used streaking grime and streaking effects to create streaks over the whole stucco and also a bit over the brickwall part. And of course I also used the dark paneline wash for all those cracks in the plaster. Blending those enamel paints over those flat surfaces introduced a lot of staining. And while that might be an unpleasant thing on a tank or on an aircraft model, it's quite great for a surface like this, since it makes it look more natural. I also did a second pass on those cracks with a black enamel pin wash to create a really deep and dark shadow. And of course, after all the dark areas were introduced, I then went back in with lactan and an off-white color to paint in a lot of highlights on all these small chips on the plaster and also on the edges of the cracks in the plaster area. Using the dark pin wash and also the highlights really gave the edges where the plaster was removed from the brick wall quite a deep 3D feeling that I really liked. And also, like on the brick wall for the railway platform, a few of those effects toned down the bricks quite a lot. So I went back in with my brick colors and glazed them over a few bricks, and then also introduced some dust stains and moss deposits on a few other bricks. Again, I used a limited color palette, but I was able to introduce quite a lot of variation in those bricks. Then it was time for even more details. I decided that I want to add a lamp over the door. I 3D printed a mount and then used a round piece of styrene that I drilled a hole in to make it more look like a tube and glued that over the door. The lampshade itself was also 3D printed, base coated in black, and then I used a bunch of dark grey and steely colors to try to replicate the zinc plated look that metal parts like this often have. That's a technique I use quite a lot in the following steps. I used again German grey as a base coat, and then I used a bunch of light grey paints and stippled them all over the surface, again closely following reference pictures. For the electrical wiring I also printed an electric junction box, and I used LED wire to add in all the electric cables. And since I still had the metal foil I also used for the roof near me, I used it to create some cable clamps to mount the cable in position. I cut off small strips of metal and then bent them around a small drill bit and glued them into place using black super glue. This was quite a tedious process, and for another part of the diorama I then decided to also 3D print some cable clamps. Again, thin LED wire for the electric wiring, and then the lamp was glued to this cable using super glue. And of course, this isn't enough detail, so I also brought back out the small 3D decal rivets I still had lying around from the FW-190 and already used on the roof, and used those to create some nail heads on the cable clamps made out of metal foil I just shown you. And again, everything was base coated in black, and then I used a bunch of metallic paints and light grays to paint in all the electrical stuff and the wiring, the cable clamps, and also the electrical junction box made from Bakelite. When I have to base coat stuff like this, I use a brush and my Scale 75 artist acrylics for that. The black is quite a deep black and it flows really nicely, so it's a great paint to use as a base coat or as a primer, if you want to say it like that, for stuff like this. And of course I also added a rust wash to the cable clamps, and after all the wiring was painted in a medium grey, I also highlighted using a light grey. The small house itself was then fixed into place using again PVA glue and left to dry overnight. And again, as I said in the beginning, I expected a small gap between the concrete surface and the house, so I left a small gap that then could be easily filled in using the putty I used for the concrete. One thing I'm not too happy about is the gap and the wooden veneer at the back. Unfortunately, it just isn't perfect. The wooden veneer on the base is offset a little bit because something wasn't completely straight, and I had to use quite a lot of putty to make it work. It's not really noticeable in the end, but I wish I could have done better at this point. Wrapping a base this large in wooden veneer isn't really an easy task, and I'm already thinking about solutions for my next projects to make it a little more pleasant and the end result a little better. And as you can see, I also added some vegetation, some dirt and some scatter material to the concrete surface and fixed it again in place using gravel and sand fixer. The sand and the small vegetation really also blended in the house to the concrete surface. And after that stuff was dry, it was once again time for a layer of Mr. Surfacer, this time the mahogany one. and then I brought back out my sponge. Sponge painting a surface this large takes quite a lot of time, and I was, to be honest, quite a bit surprised about that. It took me a couple of hours to paint this concrete surface. I again used a bunch of grayish and beige tones and stippled them all over the surface. With each successive layer I went lighter on the painting. I used lighter paints and also used less force to introduce even more texture to the surface, and I think it's clearly visible in this shot. And again, I kept my color palette limited and a little bit different from the colors I used on the house to create some more variation and some difference between the concrete on the floor and the stucco on the house. And after the basic painting was done using acrylics, I then switched back to enamels. As you just saw, I used them to create a pin wash on all those larger and finer cracks to really make them pop from the lighter concrete surface. And like on the house, the blending introduced a lot of staining, but I like this effect on a surface like this. I also used a few earth-colored enamel paints to create some earth deposits around the small vegetation and around the cracks. And you might know this by now, I like to use the enamel effects as well to paint my vegetation, and I again used slimy gram light and the moss deposits to paint the small vegetation on the concrete surface and also next to the house. For a brief second I thought about using my airbrush for that, but I didn't want to introduce any overspray to the already finished and painted areas. And I have to repeat myself to introduce even more contrast. I also then used a light color to highlight all those cracks. After that was done, it was finally time for wood stain. This teak-colored wood stain is one that I really liked and I also used for my last diorama, but for some reason it didn't really work for this project. I just didn't like the appearance, so I had to sand it down and then I used a darker wood color, as you can see in the end, or you might already spot it in the beginning. Then I decided that a lamppost would be a nice addition to the railway platform to introduce another vertical element. I again used my steel wire brush to give some wooden texture to this round piece of styrene. I then bent some copper wire, drilled a few holes and 3D printed a mounting plate for this copper wire, and this way I created a ladder on the lamppost. The boom of the lamppost also was bent from copper wire, and the clamps to mount it to the pole itself were 3D printed. And the lampshade also was 3D printed again. And the mounting bracket for the bottom of the lamppost was also 3D printed, and then I decided that some kind of loudspeaker or siren also would be another nice addition to this lamppost. And of course this was also 3D printed. The mounting clamp and the speaker itself are separate parts, so if I need it in the future I'm able to create a different angle for those parts. For 3D printed parts I like to use my black super glue, since I can clean off the excess using my super glue debonder. Then I base coated everything black and I used the same wood painting techniques that I've shown you in a few other areas in this video before. I decided to paint the wooden beam before I paint any detail or add in any more detail like the wiring, since it was way easier this way. And for the metal parts I again used German grey and a bunch of metallic paints. And I also 3D printed a few cable clamps for the lamppost, since I was a little bit too lazy to make them out of metal foil. Also, those are quite useful parts for later projects, so it's easier to 3D print them. The designing didn't take that long and printing them is only a matter of a couple of minutes. The wiring for the lamp and the speaker then was done using thin lead wire again. And I also painted those parts using the zinc plated metal techniques I've shown you earlier for the lamp that is mounted to the small shed. And you can't paint metal parts without enamel rust effects, so I again used my darker rust streaks and the lighter rust color to add in some rust effects on the lampshade, the speaker itself, but also on the clamp and the base of the lamp post. Of course, after the rust wash was dry, I then highlighted everything using light colored metallic paints and light colored grey paints, and the wires were painted using a bunch of greys and beige paints, and of course also highlighted. I then drilled a hole into this concrete surface, which was surprisingly easy, and then added a small brass tube for the electrical wiring. The lamppost itself then was glued in place using, again, super glue. The excess wiring then was put into the brass tube, and I blended the whole lamppost in using, again, some fine earth and also a bit of vegetation around the tube and the lamppost itself. After everything was fixed in place using gravel and sand fixer, I again brought back out the enamel paints, earth colored ones for the groundwork, and slimy grime light and moss deposits for the vegetation, and also a bit of moss deposits on the lamppost itself. After that, I took a look at my stash of unopened model kits. I mean my stash of opportunities. And I found this German repairman kit from MiniArt and also this toolset from MiniArt. Both kits included quite a lot of tools that I wanted to use as detail for this diorama. The trestles from the MiniArt kit for the small table I will show you in a minute weren't that convincing, so I created my own from styrene profile. I also used again my steel wire technique to create some wooden texture, and then, as you can see, everything was painted using again my Scale 75 Artist acrylics. I also again used some chipping fluid on those trestles. I gave them a grayish greenish color and then did some chipping, followed by some rust effects and also a few more highlights. And the wooden planks came from the MiniArt kit, since the wooden texture on top looked quite convincing. You already saw me painting those, and of course I also highlighted them using an off-white color. I glued all those pieces into one assembly, so it was easier to handle. I also did this for the tools after they were base coated, and it was quite a lot of work to paint so many small tools on their own. As I said, the base coating was done before I glued them in place, and then the detailing work was done after I glued them in place, since this way they were way easier to handle. And I'm sure by now it's not a surprise for you, I used German grey again as a base color, and then stippled in a bunch of random greys and highlighted those metallic parts using a metallic paint. The MiniArt tools were a really great kit. You receive quite a lot of tools and they look really great. Not also plastic parts, but also a lot of photo edge for the saw blades and stuff. If I have ever the need again to add more tools to a diorama, I for sure will purchase another one of those kits. And I also added a few larger tools that could fit the railway context to the shed we did earlier. I glued those tools using my black super glue again, and then I used again a bunch of enamel paints to paint over the super glue stains so they are invisible. And then it was finally time to add all the models to the diorama. I super glued the transport rack for the wing in place, but the wing itself isn't super glued, so I'm able to turn it around and show the upper side of the wing as well. And of course I also glued in this small table using my black super glue. Since we are now near the end, it was time for another task, and I used a graphite stick to polish the upper area of the railroad tracks to make them look like they were still in use. And I also stuck the painted brush in place. Let me now introduce you to Herbert, Hans, Hermann and Heinrich. Unfortunately, there isn't really any footage of me painting those figures, since I got quite sick in the end of 2024 and I didn't really have the nerves to film all my figure painting content. But if you like the paint job on those guys, let me know in the comments down below and I will make a separate figure painting video in the future. Those guys were then also glued in place using super glue, so they can't desert from the diorama. These resin figures are tank mechanics from Panzer Art, since it was quite hard to find any railroad personnel, but I painted them in a more generic paint scheme and I think they fit the scene quite great. Hermann was glued to the railway car and I had to rework the chain on the front transport rack so he can hold it in his hand. I of course painted this chain with the same techniques I used in the last video, where I added all the other ones. And I also added another small toolbox from the MiniArt case with a bunch of photo etched and plastic tools inside. At this point I got really excited. I glued the railway car in place using the crowd cover glue since it's removable if I ever want to put anything else on the space, and I also put the mini art water crane into its position. If you wanted to see how I paint this, I link the video down below. And finally, here's our end result. This is by far the biggest, most ambitious project I ever did, and I'm looking forward to do something smaller for the next video. I had a ton of fun building this, and I had a ton of fun creating the YouTube videos about this diorama, and I will for sure continue with that in the future. Building models and dioramas like this and also making a video about it is quite a lot of work, so I would be very grateful if you can support my work, subscribe to my channel, like this video, write a comment, and if you like, also check out my Patreon account. As I said, the next project will be quite a bit smaller, but not less detailed, and I also hope that it will be finished in a shorter time frame. Again, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Take care.